Hello and welcome. It's Francis here. Thank you for coming back to my channel. If this is your first time here, I bid thee welcome. There is a subscribe button below if you would like to help support this channel by subscribing. Also a bell to be notified as to when I upload more content. I'm coming to you from Ghana country, and as such, I acknowledge the Ghana people of the Adelaide Plains as being the traditional custodians of the lands upon which I am residing. So I've been wanting to do this video for a little while, and each time I've sort of started to compile my thoughts, I've ended up going down rabbit holes because I honestly think that there is more to discuss than what I'm wanting to talk about. It's a book review on this book, Scotia, Lost Sister of Tutankhamun by Luke Eastwood. And back in February, I was provided with a PDF copy to review. And I've ended up, as you can see, getting the physical copy. And I'm quite sure I'm going to be referring back to it or rereading it at a later stage. So if you are familiar with my channel, you know, I don't normally do book reviews. I do sometimes compare books, or when people have asked me for recommendations, I might do a video. On a very rare occasion, I will actually give my 2 cents for what it's worth of a book, but it's usually books that sort of really stir up an interest to me. And this book is one of those, not only on the subject matter, but basically since I've had it in my possession, there's been a lot of synchronicity of events that tap into, I think, one of the underlying underpinning things to the book itself, and something that I'm personally interested in, and that is the validity of sacred stories, mythology, even what people call ancestral memory, or ancestral memory when it comes to historical fact telling. So this video is going to be a combination of all that, as well as this book itself, my 2 cents for this. So before I get too carried away, a disclaimer, I'm not an expert. I'm basically just basing this video on Luke's book. I've had a little bit of history with the subject matter with Scotia, and I think that's how you pronounce the name, though it is written Scotta. I think it's pronounced Scotia. Please correct me in the comments below. Back in the 90s when I was studying Celtic myth, I've also had I guess you could say it as a meditation experience that sort of ties into this theme. So I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not an Egyptologist, I'm not a historian in any way, shape, or form. So I'm just using this book as sort of the base material for this video. I haven't really had the time to even thoroughly explore Luke's resources either, because there are other rabbit holes I'm wanting to dive down and include in this video. And I think it can open up to other areas where I guess there's better qualified people than what I'm wanting to suggest here. So before I get too carried away and find myself already plummeting down another rabbit hole, if you're wondering who Scotia or Scotia is, according to Irish and Scottish medieval legends, really. So again, this is possibly ancestral memory, what we're tapping into. She is said to have been the ancestor of the Gaels, who themselves were an insular Celtic ethno-linguistic group native to Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. And so this is a form of Gaelic, often referred to, I think it's pronounced as the Goidelic branch of Gaelic, linking these 3 countries or these 3 areas together, Scotland, Ireland, and the Isle of Man, as opposed to the Brythonic Gaelic, which is Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. And I'm also not a Gaelic speaker either, so I'm going to do the best that I can. So She is said to be the ancestor of the Gaels, of the sort of good Celtic group. She's also said to have been a daughter of a pharaoh, an Egyptian pharaoh. So how much of this is coming out of medieval literature and legends? Yeah, this is like King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, where there has been, shall we say, an influence of poetic license, speak truth. So how much of this is actually based on fact? How much of this includes ancestral memory? And how much of this is really just simply pure fantasy that's been made up with no factual foundation based anywhere? And I guess this is what Luke is trying to set out to prove in this book, where he's sort of been analyzing various histories, some of these more mythic than others, as well as the limited amount of physical evidence, albeit some of it could be perceived as circumstantial, in order to come to his conclusions. So before I shared this, as well as my own conclusions, if that's worth anything, I thought it might be a really good idea to sort of explore some of these mythic histories. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll understand why I'm wanting to sort of go down these other rabbit holes. So as I said, I'm not a Gaelic speaker. I do apologize in advance. I'm going to try and stick to the English translations. And of course, that's not always going to be a direct translation, to save further embarrassment for myself. So one of the sources comes from Geoffrey Keating, who in 1634, he published what in English is referred to as the History of Ireland. And in this book, he basically recorded Ireland's 9th name was Scotia. And it is the sons of Millay or Melly who gave that name to it from their mother, whose name was Scotia, the daughter of the pharaoh Nictonbeus, or it was why they called it Scotia, because they are themselves the Scottish race from Scotia. Interesting. Looking at the roots of the Scottish people, but already Ireland is claiming the name Scotia. Prior to this, also from Irish literature, in the 11th century, there is a collection of poems. In the English, it's known as the Book of Ireland's Taking. When I was doing Celtic mythology, I also had it referred to as the 5 or 6 invasions of Ireland. And it's in this body of work where Scotia is recorded as being the daughter of the pharaoh Necho, or Necho II, although some other sources describe her father or record her father as being Nefertopti and her mother being Senebian. And it's from these people that Scotia was actually given to Malseus as his wife, because Malseus was basically a military campaigner and helped the pharaoh in his military campaigns. Now, Necho II was the 26th dynastic king who reigned from around about 610 to 595 BCE, during a period of Egypt's history where they flourished against the Sumerians, against the Babylonians, the Judeans, and he's also mentioned in the Bible. I'm not going to get down ancestral memory there. As he is recorded there as being the pharaoh who killed the 6th king of Judah, Josiah. So there is another source, an independent source, that actually records this pharaoh or king. What is interesting about the Book of Ireland's Taking is that it tells the story of Ireland being taken or settled by these various groups of people. starting off with the peoples from Kasi. Then there are the people from the Parthenon. Then there are the people of Nimrod. Then the Furbolgs. Then the Tuatha and finally the Mysians. The first four group of people are said to have either been wiped out or they abandoned Ireland. The fifth group, the Tuatha thrived, but it wasn't until the Mysians or what's come to be the Irish people, the Gaels, arrived in Ireland that the Tuatha, according to stories, became the pagan gods or reduced themselves in size, where they became the fairy folk that live still today in the She Mountains. This book also records Scotia as being the mother of Udeglas, who is another ancestor of the Gaels. She's also said to be the daughter of another Egyptian pharaoh, this time by the name of Gertrude, who is purportedly mentioned in the King's List of Jerome. I did a quick look. I couldn't find him mentioning there. So it was only a quick look. There is also another connection with Atenkeros, who was a short-lived pharaoh or king who ruled in the late 18th dynasty. So we're looking at 1550 to 1292 BCE, just after the infamous Amarna period, which is attributed to the so-called heretic pharaoh or king Akhenaten. So somehow the Scotia mentioned in the Book of Ireland's Taking was married to Godelus's father, Niall, who himself, interestingly, is the son or was the son of another and legendary ancestors, this time of the Phoenicians of the Mediterranean. And his father was said to also be the inventor of language. If those two sources don't confuse each other or contradict each other, just adding to the matter of confusion, there's another 12th century source that mentions Scotia as being the wife of Gordon Glass, as opposed to his mother. And she again is said to be the founder of the Scots and the Gaels, but interestingly, after they were exiled from Egypt, adding to that Egyptian story. So strengthening this Scottish story, Scotia is also connected with the Stone of Scone. And this is found through the works of Baldred Bissett in his 1301 work, I think it's called Proskysis, sort of putting forward this argument that it was actually Scotland, not Ireland, that was this original homeland of Scotia. So there's all these threads of sacred stories and myth, not to mention Eastwood's own discoveries that link Scotia to being sort of forgotten about princess, that being Metin Arten, the daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And it's quite interesting to read how Luke Wood sort of weaves this narrative into the story, into his book. And again, I don't want to give away too much evidence, only to say that I found his evidence to do that rather compelling, despite it being, I guess, if I'm 100% honest, in some cases, somewhat mythic and even reliant a little bit on pseudo history. And that is the angle that I want to, or an area that I want to discuss in a moment. Eastwood also points out that in County Kerry, that I wasn't aware of, and I wish I was when I actually was in Ireland a few years ago in Kerry, that there's a rock feature there referred to as Scotia or Scots grave, which has never actually been excavated. And all this extremely compelling evidence, at least to Eastwood, where he tends to draw on a very sort of definite conclusion, is enough proof to assert that Scotia and the Egyptian priestess or pharaoh, Akhenaten, are actually one of the same. Personally, I'm not 100% convinced, due to the sort of mythic or possibility or lacking, shall I say, of the hard factual evidence. But it's clear that he's done a lot of painstaking research. And as I said, I haven't personally put any research of my own into it. And this is the point that I want to make, because I'm certainly not dismissing his conclusions. And I think he actually does present a very strong case. And in my sort of not being 100% convinced, I started pondering my own reasoning as to why I couldn't 100% agree with him. And that opened up this next point that I want to sort of talk about, that ties into the whole subject of Scotia, Akhenaten, and other characters or ancestors, beings that we know through history, and how much of this that we may tend to just dismiss as mythic truth or possibly even pseudo-history, simply due to the lack of hardcore evidence. How much do we dismiss, I should say, when it's really actually truth, just a different truth to what we are so used to looking at? Do we need to adjust our viewpoint when it comes to ancestral memory, especially when we're looking at ancient history, where, after all, we tend to look at ancient history often by making educated guesses. We're seeing it through a particular lens. And especially when we're going further back, these educated guesses often are made due to the lack of hardcore fact or physical evidence. So I guess, why do we accept some educational guesses, which are really assumptions, over ancestral memory? Why are we ignoring vital or even valid historical evidence due to our own selective biases? After all, I believe that often there are elements of truth lying just below the surface in some of these more, shall we say, interpretive styles of history telling. And the story of Scotia and her possible Egyptian connections really is a good example of this. We know that after the end of the Maya period, a lot of what related to Akhenaten was actually destroyed. And it was really also by chance that we know anything really about Tutankhamun. And that's largely thanks to Harold Carter. Yet we also know that there are a lot of gaps. And as I mentioned, the experts, meaning Egyptologists and archaeologists, are still not 100% sure as to who Atenkeros was. Were they some random isolated king or pharaoh? Was it actually Nefertiti? I get Nefertiti and Nefertari muddled up, but Nefertiti. Was it Metin Aten, or even her husband at the time? And what makes it a little bit more complicated is that the ancient Egyptian pharaohs and kings had different names that they were known by. Was it actually a throne name that was presented to the person who held that role? Then there's the fact that especially when it comes to ancient Egypt, we actually know very little. New discoveries are revealing themselves regularly from the shifting sands, not to mention that there is increasing evidence to support possibly different interpretations, shall we say. Yet in some areas, especially when it comes to ancient Egypt, we don't seem to want to open our minds. And I'm saying I'm talking more general, to other possibilities. We're sticking to a nice, safe narrative. It's almost like the benchmark that so many experts have been using still applies, despite the fact that these benchmarks are actually writings from outsiders, people who were not indigenous Egyptians, who were actually often Greek historians, such as Plutarch, which adds actually another layer of questionability, although that's not acknowledged. And that is firstly, should we say, the history that they were writing about was actually very long past and was in fact also based on ancestral memory. Secondly, they had their own biases when they were looking at an ancient culture or another culture through their own perceptions. Plutarch was Greek, for example. Greek culture at that time was extremely patriarchal. However, ancient Egyptian culture was actually matriarchal. But coming from patriarchal culture, and we see that today, there's this uncomfortability of allotting women to such a powerful role of being king or queen of a whole countryside. We see that in more recent memory too, where female scientists or archaeologists, doctors, researchers still struggle to be recognized by comparison of their male colleagues. Again, that's our Western bias that we've had steadily increasing for over 3,000 years. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. Also important, I think, to remember that at the time of Plutarch, the Egyptian culture at that time, and indeed the past being written about, as I said, was already matriarchal, matrifocal. And yes, he referred to Egyptian sources. Those sources, however, were also or had been Greek influenced for a number of generations. And there's also the possibility that we see often where, should we say, a more dominant or an outsider wanting to find out how an indigenous culture does things, they're not going to hand over all their secrets. They'll tell the researcher what they want to hear. And there could be a few exaggerations or mistruths in that. So we really don't know how accurate Plutarch's work actually was, but yet it's still being utilized as the benchmark. And a good example of that still is used today is that the pyramids on the Giza Plateau were tombs. despite there being really no evidence, and especially when they are compared to other pyramid structures that were actually tombs, like at Scotia, there is a complete difference. So we know that biases appear in the unearthing of archaeological evidence. As I said, it's still very common today. And this, I guess, is another rabbit hole to sort of fall down. And I think I've done a very good job of falling down that one. So coming back to the mythic histories, there is a kind of, I guess, liminal truth that winds its way through ancestral memory, through sacred lore, into the stories told around fires at a time that once was. That, again, I don't think we can completely dismiss as make-believe, as fantasy, as fairy tales or tall tales. In that, or the reason why we can't dismiss them is that this was once a way that the truth was actually told. And at the end of the day, if we are 100% honest, the hardcore truth can only be just as problematic due to the biases of researchers. And there's biases in histories written by the victors. There's sort of the ignored histories because it's like a shaming culture, especially if we're looking at not only how Indigenous were colonized, but also the shame culture was pretty evident in more recent memory, say in Germany and Japan following World War II. We see today how an alternative viewpoint can be very strong and circulate and be believed as a fact. So we're not necessarily getting into conspiracy theories, but did man really walk on the moon? If so, why hasn't man done it ever since? And that line as to what's truth and what's fiction is drawn depending on what you believe. And when it comes to history, especially history that goes back far in time, which may have been recorded, the only thing that we can go by really are these stories, these collections of seemingly unrelated threads that people like Luke Eastwood, in this case, has attempted to weave together. It's like restringing and reweaving a tapestry. And it may need to take a little bit of poetic license to pull it all together. However, a further point is, or what is being overlooked is, or isn't what we call history, simply based on interpretation. Again, like the continual belief that the Giza Plateau pyramids were tombs, based originally on Plutarch's interpretation, despite there being other interpretations or narratives being offered. Still, the experts continue to stick to what they're familiar with and aren't interested in doing any further exploration. Likewise, with the discoveries or questionings of the likes such as Graham Hancock, who offers an alternative suggestion, which is often rebuked without any real consideration or investigation. And I guess maybe it's just my inquiring mind. And I find all this interesting because I don't believe that we can ever be 100% certain about anything. And this is simply because our viewpoint is shaped by our biases, our familiarities, and often if we're not thinking about something, we simply do not see it. And I guess too, and if you're still watching this, maybe you're a bit interested in these sort of threads of mythic histories as well. I think too, living in a country that I do, where there has been some 60,000 plus years of continual human habitation, and where the history of the Aboriginal peoples of this land are extremely interwoven with sacred story. And basically, there is this difference in interpretation of the facts that you really have to have an opportunity to sit in circle, to be in that environment and listen to these stories and how they are being told by the people whose stories belong to. And when you do that, these histories, these ancestral memories, if you want to call it like that, they do make sense. They take you on a deeper level than what experts often give them credit for. And then there is a shift happening, at least here in Australia, of accepting, very grudgingly, this different viewpoint, this different record of history. So it's almost like a clash of minds where we are looking back at these ancient myths through our modern shaped mind, which is very scientifically driven, also very influenced over millennia of Christianity, Christian belief system that believes in a certain paradigm. Looking back at histories, at peoples, at stories, without truly being able to see all the liminal stuff, the stuff that's in the peripheral vision. We're seeing things like this, where they may have told their stories out here. And I find that really interesting. It's almost like it's alien. Yes, it's not alien to the Western mindset, because I sort of mentioned it before, and it's probably going to upset some people who are still watching us. We do accept ancestral memories or stories as fact for some people. And the first one that comes to mind are the biblical stories. And some people see those stories as more fact than stories. So I find that rather ironic that we can do that acceptance in some areas, but not in others. And I guess too, as I mentioned right at the beginning, I have a little bit of a soft spot for the story about Scotia and her Gaelic connection, because basically, as I said, since the 90s, I've spent a number of years studying Celtic mythology, and I've even written a series of essays that have appeared in various publications about these invasions, these takings of Ireland. And it's quite interesting that towards, I think it was the end of the 90s, I had this experience. We're sitting in a meditation circle or a session where the visual was that we would go into a forest and sit around a campfire and listen to this wise woman in the forest, so to speak. I didn't find myself sitting in the fire. I found myself on a boat riding the waves. And while I can't exactly remember the finer details, it was a few years ago, I do recall certain connections. First was that there was this Egyptian appearance that I had, and I sort of had this thing for ancient Egypt, basically for most of my life. I had that sort of like stereotypical bobbed jet black hair. Around my top of my arm, I was wearing sort of a golden snake bracelet thing, which is unusual because I don't usually wear gold. There was I was wearing sort of a slip dress. I can't remember exactly. I think it wasn't very sort of decorative, but it was utterly inappropriate for the adventure. It was a sort of a light colored, I guess it was linen. I recall being on the bow, the front of the boat, and sighting land as it appeared on the horizon through the sort of mist of the water and the land mist as well. And when we came out of that meditation, I was actually told that my waves apparently put out the campfire for everybody else in the meditation group. Yeah. So when Eastwood published his book, I was quite keen to find out what he had discovered all these decades since, and the tapestry that he wove together with the possible missing threads from Scotia's story. So, as I mentioned earlier, I might not 100% agree with his conclusion, but I certainly see the logic behind how it was reached. And in some parts, he goes into really great detail, providing the reader with access to the material that he had been looking at, which I guess at first seemed a little bit long-winded, but as you got into the material that he was providing you, what Eastwood was actually doing is helping to establish the direction in which he was heading into. So the more that you sort of, I suppose, think about it, it was actually a very wise move because there is so much or seemingly limited information, factual information, even the myths, the amount of myths that he came or discovered about Scotia or her connections, I found fascinating. And then added to that is like how he managed to pull what appeared to be random threads and weave them together to form a somewhat logical tapestry. Then there's also the concept behind this book, which I've just been talking about, that highlights something I feel is more profound. And that is how we look at the past. And we need to do so through the lens of those who were actually living it, not our 21st century understanding of it, in order to get a more accurate perspective. And that's probably why I don't 100% agree with his conclusion, because even though I think he did a fantastic job in pulling all these threads together, there was still an element of doubt in my own mind as to being so convinced of his outcome. But then as I unpack that, it's almost sort of telling me to take wisdom or counsel of the own words that are coming out of my mouth, in that maybe we all need to sort of look at things less linear, less hardcore fact, and flow a little bit more, be a little bit more creative, because there will be times when we will simply never, ever know, and that's okay. And also, while proven fact is important, maybe the edges need to be a little bit softened at times. And in doing so, we can allow in other possibilities. So, do I recommend the book? I think that if this is an area that interests you, definitely. But it's like you need to, I think, approach it with an open mind. If you are after hard, cold facts, you may not feel comfortable, shall I say, with how some of the sources that Eastwood use. But I think how he has used these resources, the mythic histories, it was necessary to, again, weave that tapestry as to who Scotia is or was, and in particular why she is so important to the Gaels, to the Gaelic language, because she is their mother, their ancestral mother. Now, whether that can be proven in hardcore fact or not, really doesn't matter. I think that's the point of it. Interesting read. Let me know what you think. If you have read it, let me know what you think. If you've read similar books, similar histories, where we need to take things with a grain of salt and also get out of our little mindset, let me know, because this is the sort of history that I like exploring. Not everything needs to be cast in stone. Blessings.